Hello and welcome to this quick and dirty tutorial on how to achieve Windows-like UI movement within Unity. Once we're finished, you'll be able to click anywhere on a given UI surface and move it to your heart's content. Go ahead and get started. First off, let's create a new scene. Within that scene, let's create a UI canvas. Make sure that it created an event system. And then within that canvas, we'll create a panel. We'll then set the anchor of this panel to the absolute center of our window, and we will click on that little knob right here and press the Alt key, and we will resize it down to something that is noticeable. Right. Then we will create a C# script, which we will call move UI on the panel. Go ahead and open up that move UI script, and we will go ahead and delete that. Delete this, clean up our code. All right. We'll begin by adding the using Unity engine.event systems, which will allow us to use the callbacks from the event system. We then need to choose which callbacks, which interface we want to implement. In our case, we will use iPointer handler and iPointer up handler and iDrag handler. Once you've written all of these, you'll notice that that Visual Studio is not happy. We need to implement these interfaces. So if you are on Visual Studio, you can just right-click Quick Action Refactoring, or you can always use the Control Dot key if you have the interface selected, and you can then select Implement Interface. We'll go ahead and do that for all of them. Go ahead and delete the system not implemented exception, as it will stop us from running any code. We will then move this around a little bit so that it can represent the order of operation of our little code right here. All right, so in theory, we could just write a simple line of code in order to move our window around, which is on the drag command. So on drag is called when you are click and dragging over a UI element in Unity. So in our case, it's the panel. And as we're dragging our mouse over, we could just say, well, take the transform of the position of our game object and make it the input the mouse position. We could say that, or we could say, and this is exactly the same thing, event data dot position, which would result in this behavior. Let's go ahead and wait for that. Game, and now it is moving, right? It's moving, but if I click on the side here and move, it snaps to the edge. And while, like, say you're moving an item from one inventory to another, this is fine. This is totally fine. You don't need any better than this. For an inventory system, this simple line of code is enough. But in our case, it is not enough. We need more. We want Windows-like movement. Essentially, I want to grab it like this, right? I'm grabbing it from right here, and I want to move it. So in order to achieve that, we'll have to do an interesting workaround. So here is my take on the workaround. In order to move a window from a point other than its center point, we need to create an empty UI game object. This game object follows the position of the mouse on the screen while we change the parent of the window to it. Once the window has moved to the location we desire, we switch it back to its previous parent, which is in case the canvas itself. So let's put it together and see it in action. So first step, let's go back to Unity. Let's right click on the canvas and let's make an empty game object, which we will call UI quick pos. You can call it whatever you want, but this is the game object that will represent the position of that we click. I will set it to 1, 1. I don't think it matters. I'm pretty sure you could set it to 1,000 to 1,000. I'll set it to 1, 1. And then we will click and drag it and make it into a prefab, which we will then delete the active one in the hierarchy. Let's go ahead and go back here. Now we will create a serializable member variable of type gameObject, which will be our UI click pos prefab. Now, by making that variable serializable, when we go and see panel, we have UI click pos. It's the same thing. If you've never seen serializable, it's the same thing as public, except it's private. You can only access this variable from within this script, but you can also access it from the inspector. Serializable gives you access from the inspector. So we will go ahead and drag the UI click pos prefab that we just made, which is just an empty game object. We will move that over there and set it there. Next, what is next? I need to review my notes. Create an empty game object. Change it width. Save. Delete. Right. The member variables. So we need to create a few other member variables. So these will be private. We could just add it here and just type more variables here, but we don't want to see those variables from the editor. We want to see only the one that we can affect. So this one will be the parents game object, private game object, original parent. Now it's important to note that we could be saving the transform of the parent, because when you're setting parents, you're usually dealing in transforms, but I prefer to have access to the game object. It's really just a personal preference. You could just type transform original parent, and that would work as well. You'll understand a bit more later when we write down everything, but for now let's just stick with that original parent. And then we will also make a UI click game object. So the UI click game object will be the instantiated prefab, and the original parent is our original parent. All right, so for the original parent, we need to instantiate this variable. So we will be doing that in private void awake. Private void awake, it's all about the order of operation for Unity. Essentially, awake is before start. It's before pretty much almost everything. It's as the game object is waking up, right? Awake. So private void awake, we want to set the original parent to transform parent game object. So we're setting the game object of our parent's game object as this variable. Now, when we are clicking a dead down, we want to UI click equals. So we want to instantiate our prefab within script, right? So UI click, we're saying that this variable is equal to instantiate. We're instantiating this variable as we're setting it. UI click pos prefab transform dot parent. So here we are creating a new clone game object of type UI click pos prefab, our empty game object that we made, and we are setting its parent to the canvas that we are in, the panel. So UI click, and then after that, we can set the position of the UI click we got click dot transform dot position equals event data dot position. And lastly, because we are doing a parenting trick, we're going to set transform dot set. We're going to set the parent of our game object to the UI click dot transform. So we're setting the parent to the object that we just created. So essentially, we are becoming a child to our child. No, it's a little weird, but that's how it is. Now we can go ahead and actually test this, and you're gonna see some funny behavior. When we click this, nothing actually happens. But if we go into hierarchy, we've got a lot of game objects that are childed. This is essentially happening because we're not making sure that we already have it. So what we could do is either destroy this game object and create one every time, but it's kind of good to recycle our data, right? There's no point in the computer having to create, the engine having to create and destroy the same thing, especially if you're going to use it all the time, right? So we're just going to go ahead and fix this by adding a little check. If UI click equals null. If it's null, then make another one of this, which it should only be null once, right? Because we're making one. So lastly, for this first step, well, not lastly, what am I saying? We're almost there though. When we click up, we need to set the parent back to its original because we don't want to be childed to the UI click object every time, because the second that we move it, the panel would move with it. Like say you click on another point of your UI game object and you haven't, your panel is still childed to it. The panel is going to move to that spot before it gets dragged. It's going to create some funny behavior. So we want to transform dot set parent back to the original parent dot transform. So we're sending it back. And then lastly, the last thing that we need to do is move the empty game object. So UI click dot transform dot position equals the event data dot position. And here we are, a completely finished UI game object that moves when you click on it from anywhere, completely mimicking the Windows-like feature. So I hope you enjoyed this quick and dirty video of how to achieve Windows-like UI movement. Like and subscribe. This is my first time doing this. I have no idea if I'll do it again. All right, go bye.